Hey, hey, hey! My name's Helen the Scripted, or Nephilim if you'd prefer. Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. I am so excited to dub this chapter after the wholesome ending of the last one. This is chapter 7 of Sitting in a Tin Can, written by Aurorian on AO3. Here are the trigger warnings before I get into the chapter. This fanfiction includes topics that may be triggering to some viewers if you are likely to be affected by any of the following: implied homophobia, implied prostitution, and implied drug dealing, then please consider listening to one of my other videos, such as the Adro series, which is written by XX Cypress Minerva XX. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 7. My spaceship knows which way to go. Daichi woke up to an alarm that wasn't his, and an unfamiliar heat at his back. He looked over his shoulder and nudged Suga in the gut with his elbow. "Wake up!" His voice was crackly when it came out, and Daichi groaned lowly when he tried nudging Suga again. Suga removed his hand from Daichi's waist and pushed his face away. He murmured a soft, "No." The alarm still rang loudly, too loudly, but Daichi was struggling to keep his eyes open and couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. "Suga!" He pushed Daichi's face into his pillow with a sleepy whine. "Please, turn off your alarm." His voice was muffled against the soft polyester of his pillowcase. Suga sighed loudly and sat up with a grunt. Daichi missed the weight of him, but he didn't care that it had gone as long as the stupid alarm stopped ringing. Suga lifted up Daichi's duvet and ran his hands along the mattress. "Just follow the sound," Daichi said into his pillow. "I am." Suga's warm fingers wriggled their way under Daichi and slid beneath the length of his ribs. "I think you're lying on it, Dai." Daichi grumbled a mess of sleep-addled nonsense and sat up. He rubbed at his eyes as Suga leaned forward and searched the spot where Daichi had been lying. He lifted the pillow and finally shut off the alarm on his phone. "Why didn't you?" Daichi interrupted himself to yawn and blink away the sleep from his eyes. "Leave your phone on the dresser." Suga caught his yawn as he put the pillow back onto the mattress and slapped it back into shape. "Just a habit to throw it down wherever, I guess." He moved to the side of the bed and put his feet down on the ground. "This isn't the first time I've lost it while the alarm was ringing." "How does someone even manage that?" Daichi stretched his hands over his head and sighed contentedly at the cracks in his spine. He heard Suga dragging his feet as he walked and watched him shrug his shoulders. "You couldn't find it either," he pointed out. "Oh, shush!" Daichi got off the bed and followed Suga into the kitchen. "What time do you need to be at work by?" He glanced at the clock on the microwave. It was 5:30. Good grief. "School starts at 8:30, but I volunteered to coach the volleyball club." Suga flicked on the electric kettle and Daichi moved to the cupboards to take out 2 mugs. "And it starts so early? Don't you teach elementary schoolers?" He put the mugs next to the kettle. "Coffee or tea?" he asked. "Coffee with sugar, please." Suga shuffled to the other side of the small kitchen and sat down at the table. He crossed his arms over the wooden surface and pillowed his head in the nook between his elbows. "It takes 2 hours for me to get ready for school because of buses and the train. And on top of that, some of the older kids decided they wanted to start morning practice. There'll be menaces on the court by the time they're in middle school, I swear to God." Daichi poured the boiling water over the granules of instant coffee in the mugs and watched the water rise. "You think any of them will go to Karasuno?" Maybe we can bag a Nationals victory. Maybe. Suga sat up to take his mug from Daichi and blew over the rim of the painted blue ceramic before setting it down on the table. We're closer to Alba Josai, though. Daichi sat down across from him and laughed quietly and wrapped both hands around his mug. Training the enemy, for shame! Suga snorted out a puff of air from his nose and took the smallest sip of his coffee. They drank in silence because Daichi was way too tired to even think about words. His alarm usually rang at 6:30, and even though it was only an hour difference, he felt like he was in an alternate universe. The clock on his mantelpiece ticked so loudly that he could hear it even though it was all the way in the living room, and the sky was glowing red with the first flickering of sunshine behind those neighbouring houses. It was nice, sitting with Suga so early in the morning, with the ticking of the clock and the occasional sip of coffee hanging between them was nice, homey. Daichi thought it was a little bit funny how he'd had a house for over a year, but it never felt as domestic as it did in that moment. Maybe it was because he'd never woken up next to someone that wasn't a drunk and passed out Tanaka or Asahi the occasional time he needed somewhere to stay in Miyagi at short notice. By the time Daichi was 3/4 way done with his coffee, Suga was humming quietly to himself. He tilted his head back and drank the last little bits from his mug. You got any clothes I can borrow for school today? Daichi looked up at Suga, and his eyes drifted to the beauty mark beside his eye, which had been illuminated by the now golden light from the window. I'll see if I can find something that'll fit you. Considering that you're barely 2 centimeters taller than me, I'm sure you will. Suga shook his head, amusement pulling his lips into a soft smile. Although you do have quite broad shoulders. Daichi sat up a little straighter as he watched Suga's hazel eyes flicker from his right shoulder to his left, and then back to his face. His smile got a fraction of a centimeter bigger. Let's go look then, Daichi said, and stood up to put his mug in the sink. Suga did the same, and followed Daichi back into his room. He landed on his arse, right on top of the unmade bed, and Daichi could feel the pricking of his eyes on his back as he opened the wardrobe on the other side of the room. He was aware of every movement he made, and quickly looked through the shirts on the hangers. Daichi pulled out a light blue button-up, and tossed it over to Suga. That'll probably fit. It's a bit too tight on me, he said, and looked through his very limited tie collection. The shuffling of clothes being removed halted for a second after he asked. What colour tie do you want? That maroon one you just had your hand on, please. Daichi took the tie off the hanger and threw it in the general vicinity of the bed. Thanks. The shuffling behind him continued. He took his uniform off its hanger and closed the wardrobe. You decent? Yep, Suga said, and Daichi turned around. Suga was right. The shoulders were a little loose, but everything else looked like it fit. Daichi watched his slender fingers tie a knot in the tie with practiced precision. He pulled his eyes away and started getting changed into his own work attire. He kept his gaze trained on the floor. Even though he didn't really know why, Suga had seen him get changed in the club room too many times to count, but it felt different now. Now that they were adults, and they didn't have to share a changing room every day. I haven't seen you in your police uniform in ages. Suga's comment got him looking up again, as he straightened up the navy vest. It suits you. Suga plucked his hat off the bedside dresser and walked over to Daichi, stepping close into his space. He balanced it on his dark hair and straightened up the rim. Thanks. Daichi pulled it further down his forehead and returned Suga's smile. You need me to drop you to school? I don't have work for another little while. I'd really appreciate it. His voice was soft, soft enough that it sounded like a whisper, but still loud enough to echo between Daichi's ears minutes after he'd said it. They left a short while after that. He lived a lot closer to Suga's school than Suga did, so it didn't take long at all, and when Daichi pulled into the parking lot to drop him off, he felt a little dumb for not taking the long way, just so he could have had the chance to speak with him just a little bit longer. "I'm afraid I won't be up to much sleuthing today," he said before opening the car door. "I stay with Kaito after school, so I'll be late getting home." "Don't worry about it." Daichi watched Suga grab his coat from the back seat. "I'll try to get a wise me to come and help me." Suga climbed out of the car and then turned back with an encouraging grin and a thumbs up. "Good luck! I believe in you!" He shut the door with a slam, and Daichi laughed to himself as he turned the key in the ignition. Daichi sat on the park bench, his phone pressed against his ear as he watched people walk by. It only took a few seconds for Hirama to pick up. "Hello?" "Hirama-kun?" Daichi smiled, even though she couldn't see him. "I just wanted to ask Manaka a few questions." There was a quiet talking from the other side of the line, and Daichi assumed Hirama was covering the mic on her phone. "Hey, Sawamura." Manaka almost startled him by how suddenly she spoke. "What did you need?" Daichi moved his phone to his left ear and rooted in his pockets for his notebook. "I was just wondering if you could tell me where you and Oikawa split up, and which train you took to come back to Miyagi." The breath Manaka took was amplified by her mic, and Daichi pulled out a pen from his breast pocket to take everything she said down. With a sigh, Daichi threw his hat into the back seat of his car and tapped the steering wheel with his index fingers. He looked out the front window at the apartment building in front of him, only 5 stories high, but from where he was sitting, it looked towering. He wasn't sure why he felt so nervous. All he was doing was trying to get a wise me back on the case. Not only had he helped a lot more than he realized, continuing to look for Oikawa without him seemed wrong in some way, like he and Suga were doing something behind his back. Daichi unbuckled his seatbelt, reaching behind him to get his backpack, and got out of his car. He briskly walked over to the front door of the building and scanned down the list of names next to the buzzers and pressed on the one for Awaizumi. With a hum of static, the speaker came to life. "Hello?" Awaizumi's voice was muffled and a lot flatter than usual. "Hey," Daichi said into the mic. "It's Daichi, can I come up?" The static cut off for a beat, and Daichi held his breath while he waited for the silence to end. Awaizumi's voice came back only a second later. "Sure." Daichi sighed in relief and pushed open the front door of the building. As he walked up the stairs, he felt like his shoes echoed throughout the entire building. The heels tapped against the floor, and Daichi was reminded of the ticking clock from that morning. But where the steady beat of the clock on his mantle had been soothing and softened by Suga's presence, this one was made more ominous due to the lack of it. It was just him and his clicking shoes in the stairway. Thankfully, he didn't have to walk far. Awaizumi lived on the 3rd floor, so it wasn't like Daichi had to go all the way up to the top. He walked along the corridor, reading the numbers on the apartment doors, and stopped in front of the number 9. He raised his fist for just a second and stared. Daichi was confident that Awaizumi would still help them. Oikawa had been his best friend after all. So he tapped his knuckles against the wooden door, just under the peephole, and stood back. Awaizumi opened the door. His hazel eyes searched for a second before landing on Daichi's face. "Hey," he said, and opened the door wider. "Come in." Daichi walked over the threshold and stepped out of his shoes. He heard the door click shut behind him, but instead of turning to look at Awaizumi, His eyes flickered to every corner of the room. It was a studio, but it was nice, and Wisemee didn't seem to have a lot of things, so the room didn't feel cluttered or overcrowded. His bed was pushed against the furthest wall next to a fairly big window, and the rest of the studio apartment was taken up by a kitchenette and a kotatsu in front of the small couch that Daichi assumed marked where the living area should be. Right between the bed and Wisemee's wardrobe was a sliding glass door that led out to the smallest balcony Daichi had ever seen. Wisemee brushed past him and leaned against the landing that separated the kitchen from the rest of the room. I don't want to help you find him, Daichi. Daichi felt like stamping his feet and making that whiny noise toddlers made when their parents refused to buy them things in the grocery store. But he was a grown man, and he didn't think Wisemee would take too kindly to that. But what if he needs to be found? What if his body is in a lake somewhere, weighed down by some cinder blocks? Daichi pointed to his uniform. I see shit like that all the time. Wisemee gave him a flat look. You yell at teenagers for throwing cigarette butts on the street. You don't see gruesome murders, Daichi. You're not a detective, remember? But you don't want to make sure he's okay. That he's alive, he insisted, folding his arms across his chest. Even if he doesn't want to come home when we find him, don't you want to make sure that nothing bad's happened to him? Wisemee was silent as he stood across from Daichi. He shifted his weight away from the landing and looked to the side of the apartment where his bed was. Daichi followed his gaze. Nice shirt. He nodded to the pale green graphic t-shirt haphazardly thrown on top of Wisemee's duvet. Didn't take you for an alien guy. He looked back at Wisemee, who shrugged. Not, he said, and finally met Daichi's eye again. He breathed in deeply for a second, then nodded. I'll help you find him, but I don't plan on dragging him home if that's not what he wants. Daichi felt his face split into a grin. I knew you would, he said, and pulled out his laptop from his bag. Come on, let's set this up. Wisemee remembered what the days after Oikawa's case turned cold felt like. He remembered because whenever he looked at that dumb alien t-shirt, he'd laughed at it so many times, or those few instances where someone thought it might be funny to call him Iwa-chan, or whenever he heard the sound of a killer jump serve causing the ball to ricochet off the wooden gym floorboards. He relived it. He relived that feeling. The pain of his body being split open, a ravine that started in the back of his throat and cracked all the way down to his navel, where his heart left open and exposed in a crater that was once his chest. It made him lightheaded and woozy. Sometimes when those feelings came, he smiled, because then he could at least pretend that he was reminiscing on a childhood memory or something. He could pretend that Oikawa's disappearance hadn't derailed his entire life, like it hadn't tossed him around like a bartender mixing a martini in a cocktail shaker. But Wisemee found that he didn't think about a particular memory when those moments hit him. It was just the dreadful feeling of Oikawa not being there with him. And it sort of felt like Wisemee's body couldn't function in his absence. Like whenever he was reminded that someone had always been by his side, and that he was never alone before, like he was now. He shut down. It was something the universe seemed to enjoy telling him. Wisemee Hajime should not exist without Oikawa Toru, and in doing so, he was actually unraveling fate's threads. He was destroying the plans written in the stars, and he needed to be punished. And Oikawa didn't even want to be found. He understood what Daichi and Suga were trying to do and why they wanted to involve him, but it hurt. Wisemee had gotten used to those dreadful feelings coming in bursts and disappearing after a day or two, but this was constant. For a while, it had seemed like they were on track. They had more information than they had ever been given, and Awaizumi had started to let the smallest trickle of hope run through his veins. But then Oikawa didn't want to be found. That kept repeating in his head. Oikawa didn't want to be found, and the constant hum in his chest that stemmed from his heart broke loose. It flooded his body, and he kept smiling, trying to pretend that he was thinking about Oikawa walking with his hand clutching Awaizumi's bicep in the quiet of a cold October night, or him setting a ball with perfect precision and relying on his ace to hit it through a 3-person block. His smiles quickly turned to teeth clenched so hard that they hurt his jaw. He still tried, though, especially now that Daichi was sitting down in his apartment, his laptop perched on Awaizumi's kotatsu. I thought this investigation was going to have a lot more fingerprints and DNA samples. Awaizumi let his arse fall onto the floor next to Daichi. This just feels like stalking. Daichi's fingers moved across his keyboard, and his eyes stayed tacked to the screen. Well, I told you when we started, it's just watching other people do things for hours. He made a little noise of triumph and shoved the laptop a little closer to Awaizumi as he pulled up security footage of a train station. I managed to get quite a bit of train footage. Daichi raised his hips and pulled out his phone from his back pocket. According to Harama-kun, this is the route Oikawa and Manaka-kun went after they came back. He opened up a map and zoomed in on a street near the train station. They split off at about here. His index finger circled around a crossroad. So we're basically following him on the tapes to see where he goes? Awaizumi asked, and watched the train on Daichi's laptop pull into the station. Exactly, he replied. He watched the train doors open on the grainy feed and felt his palms begin to sweat as more and more people trickled out of the carriages. Awaizumi watched every face, because he didn't want to miss him. And for a second he thought he did, until 2 people, a man and a woman, stepped onto the platform. Awaizumi recognized the woman as Manaka Uji, and he watched her step out first. Oikawa was only a few milliseconds behind. He stumbled a little on his right leg as he got off, but she put a hand out to stop him from falling. Awaizumi heard himself swallow. The last time he had laid eyes on Oikawa before this shitty quality security camera footage was about a month before it was captured. This was the most recent image of Oikawa he was seeing. His hands shook on his thighs. There he is, he mumbled. If Daichi hadn't been so close, Awaizumi doubted that he would have heard. There he is, Daichi repeated, a lot less quiet, but a more soft. And that's Manaka-kun. All we gotta do now is follow them. And that's what they did. Daichi switched from camera to camera as the odd pair moved out of the frame. Every time he caught a glimpse of Oikawa's face, Awaizumi felt like his heart started beating faster. He was convinced he was having heart palpitations at one point when Oikawa and Manaka passed a small antique store, and the camera was a lot lower than the rest of them. The frame was blurry, and the quality was shitty, but it felt like Awaizumi was seeing Oikawa in HD. But he didn't look just as Awaizumi remembered. His hair had grown a little longer, although it still fluffed out away from his face, and his cheeks had a little bit more colour, but the thing that really changed was the way his face was set. No smile or frown or even that dumb smirk he tried to pull off as genuine. It was just blank. For someone who was planning on never seeing his loved ones again, Oikawa looked almost uninterested. Like he was just walking down the street with his friend. Like he wasn't usually so animated, no matter how he was feeling. Awaizumi wiped his sweaty hands on his sweatpants. They're splitting up, he said, and Daichi got closer to the screen. I looked over it a little before I got here, he said, and pulled up another window with a different angle so they could follow Oikawa instead of Manaka. Just to make sure I got videos that kept him in frame. I feel like me being here was just unnecessary, he said, and watched Oikawa move further and further from the last known person to have talked to him. If you were gonna watch it by yourself anyway. Daichi didn't reply, but instead kept his eyes focused on the screen. It didn't take long for Oikawa to move out of frame again, and Daichi switched to the next recording of security footage. He fast-forwarded it to almost exactly the point where Oikawa was visible again, and a wise me couldn't help but be a little impressed. After everything was said and done, at least Daichi could tell everyone what a pro he was at looking at shitty videos that were over 5 years old. And that's where we lose him. Daichi sat back against the couch, and a wise me could swear he heard himself blink. What? He looked at the laptop and then back at Daichi. What the fuck do you mean? That's where we lose him. Where are the other tapes? Daichi leaned forward and began to close all of the open windows on his laptop. Well, the one we just watched was the last video he showed up on that I could actually get permission to have, he explained. So what? He just disappeared? He asked and looked at the paused video still open on the laptop. The trees and fences that served as a backdrop around Oikawa was familiar. Very familiar. Show me where that is on the map. Daichi held his phone out to show a wise me the map, and let his index finger hover over the screen. You know where it is? He took the phone from Daichi and went into Street View. Uh-huh. His eyebrows knitted together as he hummed in confirmation. That's near where we grew up, like really near. Fuck! Daichi breathed out and took his phone back. You think he went home? Nah. A wise me shook his head. No way. I would have heard something about it from Oikawa's sister, Kanami. They both sat in silence for a beat. Do you think we should drive down there and see what we can find? Yeah. Daichi nodded. I should call Suga first, though. Go ahead. Daichi almost laughed at how fast Daichi stood up from the floor with his phone in his hand. He walked a couple of steps before he turned back around to look down at a wise me. Can I use your balcony? Sure. A wise me watched him go over to the sliding glass door next to his bed and step onto the small balcony. If he was being honest, it was more like a wide windowsill with a barrier. He wondered if Daichi was aware of his own feelings, or better yet, if Suga was aware of Daichi's feelings. It was pretty obvious to a wise me. It was hard to miss the way Daichi stood as close as possible to Suga, or the way he smiled whenever Suga touched him, even if he looked like he didn't notice it himself. He didn't want to say he was jealous, because he wasn't, but he had a longing for that kind of love, too. He'd always assumed that he and Oikawa had something similar. It was the sort of love that didn't bloom out of nowhere one day, but it had always been there, sitting dormant, waiting for the two people who shared it to finally meet. It reminded him of Plato and how he thought that soulmates used to be one entity, split down the middle by Zeus, because it felt an awful lot like how the Greeks described it. Two halves that made a whole, always searching for that other person so that they could feel complete, so that they could feel healed. A wise me thought that was what Oikawa was to him, and he also thought that that was what Suga was to Daichi. You ready to go? Daichi slid the back door open and peeked his head through. A wise me looked down at his sweatpants and hoodie, which was fraying at the hem, and shrugged. Yeah, I guess. You should ask Suga out, Awaizumi watched the unlit street lights flicker past as they drove. The car swerved the smallest bit to the right and Daichi forced out a cough. What? Why? Awaizumi rolled his eyes. Maybe he didn't know about his own feelings. Because you like him, obviously, he said. Why else? Daichi watched the road, but Awaizumi could see his olive skin get paler around his knuckles as he gripped the steering wheel. Shit, am I really that obvious? Awaizumi snorted. He raised his hand above his head and held on to the grab handle just in case Daichi actually swerved off the road. You mean you aren't trying to be? He asked. I could tell the second we saw him on your porch. Daichi's hands loosened on the wheel and he rolled his wrists. You think Suga knows? Awaizumi shrugged. I don't know him that well, but yeah, probably. Daichi cursed and sat back in his seat so the back of his head hit the rest behind him. And you still think I should ask him out? Listen. He removed his hand from the grab handle and pulled at the frayed hem of his hoodie. Oikawa knew I loved him, but I didn't do anything about it. I planned to when he came back from Argentina, but, you know. His throat tightened painfully, and he turned his head back to the window. I never got the chance to, and I've been miserable ever since. Daichi didn't say anything, but he pulled over the car. This is where he disappeared, he said, and Awaizumi took in the area. It was a lot closer to their childhood homes than he realized. Which way was he walking again? He asked. Daichi looked at the map on his phone. That way. He pointed to the left. I don't think he came home then, Awaizumi said, mostly to himself. He felt a rush of nostalgia as he looked down the street where Oikawa was last seen, and something in him clicked. But I think I know where he did go. Daichi's eyes widened a little. What? Where? Awaizumi didn't answer because he had already climbed out of the car, and then he was running. He didn't expect to find Oikawa because it had been 5 years and he doubted he'd stayed so close to home, but he ran anyway. He could hear Daichi at his heels and then he could see him in his peripheral, running right next to him. It didn't take long to reach the old road with the half-constructed sports centre and the barely standing buildings. Awaizumi skidded to a halt when they got to the chain-link fence with the "Do Not Enter" signs. It looks different during the daytime, he said through heavy pants, and then he put his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. Daichi was a little less out of breath, but he was still breathing a lot heavier than usual. I drive past this place on the way to work. He walked towards the fence. You sure he came here? Awaizumi stood up straighter. Only one way to know for sure. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. The last couple weeks have been a ride. I did my first Lambda exam and I am waiting for the results now, and rehearsals have continued to be in full swing for our final show at college. Also, I apologise if you heard thunder or rain during the last part of the video. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments below. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, Aurorian on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like, and you subscribe to the channel, and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!